Well, good morning, brethren. It's delightful to be back here with you once again. 2 weeks ago, we were down in South Louisiana, and in fact, saw Mr. and Miss Pierce down there. He says he's following me around or something, checking up. No, we, as I think many of you know, Myra Pierce is going to be moving out of the area back to South Louisiana. We're certainly going to miss her here from the congregation. But anyway, it's very nice to have Mr. and Miss Pierce here visiting with us back from South Louisiana. But anyway, we were down there 2 weeks ago. Had a chance to visit the congregations there on a regional trip, and then to be there for my son's wedding on Sunday. And that was, of course, a very happy and special occasion. Last Sabbath we were up in Arkansas, and I had opportunity to visit our congregations in Russellville and Little Rock, and spend some time up there visiting and counseling. We came on back. In fact, I have been in San Diego all week. As some of you know, those of you who are in Spokesman's Club, we had a meeting of the Council of Elders out there on Tuesday and Wednesday. I flew out Monday morning and came back Thursday night. But anyway, things went very well. We had opportunity to discuss a number of things and be able to give you a little bit of news and update. We one of the things that we looked at had to do with the initial audit of our 1997 financial statement was completed. In fact, during the time I was out there, we were able to go over some of that, and it is encouraging, as the year is still young, but it appears that we are running ahead of budget in terms of income, and if things continue as they appear to be shaping up this year, this 1998, it appears, is shaping up as a year of significant growth, and so we're very excited about that and the opportunities that will hold out ahead of us. We'll just have to see how things continue to move along, but at least as the year is beginning, that does appear to be the case, and that's exciting from a variety of standpoints. You had opportunity to see the telecast here today, and that is going out. We are looking at adding right now. We're wanting to increase our coverage in terms of public access stations, and if income holds up, we are looking to be able to add to increasingly add some commercial stations at a little later time. But we'll just have to continue to be praying about that as God will have to open the doors by providing the finances there. But we were able to do some planning in terms of literature up and coming. The new. In fact, I'll go ahead and tell you the semi-annual letter offer this spring is going to be a new booklet on the holy days, which will come out. We now have the booklet on the Sabbath, and this is going to be something that is going to be offered to the whole mailing list. But anyway, we're excited about some of those opportunities that are opening up. The response to the telecast has been improving, and we're that has from 1997. It seems like, for one thing, we talked about some of the reasons why. I think part of it, Mr. Meredith felt, was that frankly, many of the newer programs have been stronger, as you heard here. This one, and he was setting the stage for the next following program, which is obviously the one that is going to air the week after this one airs. It's going to be a very strong program in terms of identifying many of these things, and the response, it seems, has significantly gone up. I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 or 40% in terms of response to the stronger programs. So that's been encouraging. We're now up to 15 booklets that are in print, and we're looking to add number 16, the Holy Days. We have several others that are in the works including a booklet on the proof of the Bible that I'm working on, one on the Middle Eastern prophecy that Mr. Raymond McNair is working on, and then some others Mr. Meredith is working on as well. We had opportunity. We're in the process. Another booklet, or what will eventually be published as a booklet, is going to be a booklet that is going to include our statement of beliefs. And we're in the process of working on that. Mr. Raymond McNair has been putting that together, and we had opportunity to go over and discuss and do some editing on various things. We want it to be comprehensive, and yet we don't want it to be a multi-volume set of spelling out everything in detail. So the process of trying to include everything that needs to be included, and yet not make it so large that it's people are not going to use it or read it. So what we're going to do is to go through, and we're going to key in other literature booklets that will go into greater detail on many of these subjects. And sometimes just this, in terms of how some of this works through. When one person sits down and writes it, Mr. McNair, it's been primarily his project. But you sit down and you put something together, somebody else looks at it and they say, well, did you know you left out this or you didn't mention that? Well, no, I hadn't thought of that. I'll give you one example. For instance, in going through the statement on the Ten Commandments, and we're going down through under the Sixth Commandment, thou shalt not kill. There, of course, was a general statement. Then there was a subsection dealing with the subject of abortion, which was very well done and very much to the point. But as we were going through there in our meeting, I noticed that there was not a specific statement on the subject of military service and war, for instance. And so we brought that up and discussed it. And after the meeting, Mr. Raymond McNair and I went back to his office, and we wrote within just a matter of a short time a statement there that emphasizes the fact that historically, from the time of the first century, the members of the Church of God have always been conscientious objectors in terms of warfare. And we went through a statement of about 2 paragraphs on the subject, and in fact, it was sort of funny because when we went back there, Mr. McNair and I went back to his office. Norbert Link, who's the attorney for the church, came in there, and the three of us stood there and discussed it. And one of the things we were discussing is the fact that we're writing something not only for the United States, but that's going to go around the world, and that various nations have various different laws, and we want to state clearly what we believe, and yet things that people are confronted with in different countries. And we stood there and discussed it a little bit. And Mr. Link left. He had to do something else. And Mr. McNair kept saying, I think we can get this done in just a few minutes. And Mr. Link thought it was going to be a little more involved process. Well, he left. And I guess about 10 minutes later, Mr. McNair and I had done what we did. And he put it in, inserted it in the, had his computer going. And he just inserted it in and printed out those pages. Well, walked across the there in the lobby. Mr. Link came out of his office, and several were standing around. And I looked at him and I said, well, we're finished. And he got this surprised look on his face, and he says, you're finished? You already have that done? And I said, it's amazing how quickly you can get things done when you get the lawyers out of the way. Amazingly, everybody that stood around, they did just what you did. They thought you get the lawyers out of the way, well, you get things done in a hurry. So anyway, but we had some good some good meetings and had a chance to go through and discuss a number of things. We, as a regular matter, we have a minimum of 3 meetings of the Council of Elders through the course of the year. This was our first meeting for 1998. We will probably have another one in the summer and another one right after the feast. Those dates are going to be set hopefully fairly soon. That way we purchase airline tickets well in advance and take advantage of the discounts. Several, of course, are of the council have to fly in to San Diego, and many are based right there at headquarters. So it gives us a chance to get together in that way about 3 times a year, and then occasionally we may have a meeting by phone hookup, which we can do from time to time. But that anyway worked out well. You know, one of the things about being out there, because in my case, for instance, I don't get out there that often. When I am there, then I try to sandwich in a number of other things, and we had opportunity to have some meetings regarding editorial, and if I can get my part of it speeded up, we will have a correspondence course that will be being offered in the near future. But we have a great deal of work has been done on it, but there's more yet to do. In the first few numbers, we want to have 6 issues or six issues completed, all the writing and everything done when we offer it to the public, so that we can keep up with a once a month thing, because there's work involved. We have a 12-lesson outline done. Questions are done for all 12 lessons, but there's a lot of writing and other things, that articles and box-type articles and explanations that have to be put in on the various subjects. So we want to have the first 6 lessons completed before we offer it, so that we don't offer it, people get the first one, and wait 2 or 3 months, and they get the second one, and it drags out. We want to be able to be timely with it. The fee sites, by the way, you might be interested in those. I can tell you our fee sites coming across on the southern tier. The Florida site is Panama City is going to be the Florida location up in the Panhandle of Florida, and then we're going to have Kerrville, Texas, Flagstaff, Arizona, and Desert Palm Springs in California. Then coming across the midsection of the country, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, Branson, Missouri, are going to come across that way. Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Then we're going to have Florence, Oregon, up on the coast. Vernon, British Columbia. Niagara Falls, there in Canada, and one in Prince Edward Island up in the Maritimes, and that'll be the North American fee sites. There is going to be an Israel fee site as well, that has been approved. In fact, Mr. Richard Ames is going to be leading the tour there in Israel, and I think there are going to be others. I think Mr. Don Davis is going to be there, and I'm not sure who all else, but I know Mr. Ames is scheduled to be leading that. You know, we try to kill 2 birds with one stone. So during the feast, as Mr. Ames will be over there for the feast, we will take advantage of being over there for the feast to get some film footage and to get some material for the telecast, which can be utilized. You make one trip, and you do, in that way, try to get maximum benefit on some of those things. But anyway, I'll give you a little bit of a flavor and an update of things from out at headquarters. Now, in terms of local announcements, the husband of one of our members in the Gladewater congregation, Mrs. Velma Cook's husband, Mr. Bud Cook, died this past Wednesday night of heart failure. Mr. Cook has had health problems for quite a number of years. I had opportunity of visiting with Mr. and Ms. Cook just a short time ago, and he has had some ongoing health problems, and so in that sense it was not some total shock, and yet there's always certainly an element of shock when something like that occurs, and I know Mrs. Cook would appreciate your prayers. The funeral is going to be this afternoon in Maybank, Texas. We have a sympathy card over by the sound table for people here in the Dallas congregation to sign. Mrs. Cook's address, Mrs. Velma Cook, Route 11, Box 145, Palestine, Texas, 75801. So please be remembering Mrs. Cook in your prayers. I think she and her husband have been married somewhere around 60 years, so that's a long, long time. We're delighted to have Mrs. Lucille Smith and Mrs. Gracie Birdwell back here with us today after health problems have kept them away for quite a long time. That's great to have them able to be here with us. Mrs. Smith would request your prayers for her nephew's wife, Donna Johnson. Donna has experienced a blockage in the artery going from her stomach down her leg, and an operation was performed Thursday. She's now in ICU at Presbyterian Hospital, so please be remembering her in your prayers. There will not be choir practice today. Mr. Hoy is going to be leaving shortly after services to be back in Maybank for the funeral. A reminder for those of you here in the area that we're going to be having Bible study this Tuesday. I look forward to seeing you this Tuesday, 7:30 at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Chrisman. That's going to be right here for the Dallas area. There is a map to the Chrisman's home posted on the bulletin board that you'll be able to check. I think that pretty well updates us on things. There will be a March-April schedule posted on the board as well. I'll, by the way, look forward to being back here with you next Sabbath as well. Going for a record, going to make 2 in a row here. Though, from what I understand, you had such an outstanding attendance last Sabbath, I may ought to stay away more often. That may be more like it, huh? Well, brethren, there of course has been an ongoing situation in the Middle East. A great deal of things that have been occurring, and we were right up at the point where it appeared that there was going to be an outbreak of war, and now, of course, everything is solved. There's peace in our time. Saddam Hussein has become a nice fellow, and all of a sudden, everything, no more problems in the Middle East. Well, I don't think any of us here believe that. You're not. There has been, of course, ongoing problems in the Middle East. An ongoing situation that has been continuing on and on and on. And the book of Zechariah talks about Jerusalem becoming a cup of trembling to all people, all nations, and all that burden themselves with it are going to be cut to pieces. And we find that the focal point of much of end-time prophecy does center in the events of the Middle East. And so the fact that this particular crisis, that the heat has been turned down, instead of boiling and bubbling over, the pot is merely simmering. The point is, it's still being cooked. But as you look at all of the things going on in the Middle East, you come back to the fact that ultimately what we are reading about, what we are encountering in the Middle East, is the outgrowth of problems in the family of one man. Ultimately, much of the problem, the heart and core of the problem, gets down to the question of which son was the legitimate heir of Abraham. And the promises made to Abraham. Was Ishmael the legitimate heir and the one who was to inherit, or was Isaac the one who was to inherit? Well, we're introduced to the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. And there are several layers of this story. One is simply the matter of history, the events of one man and his family and what happened in his life. But that's only the surface of it, because there are also prophetic implications based on the promises made to Abraham, which become the basis of much of the prophecy that we find through the rest of the Bible, because in many ways, the rest of the Bible, beginning in Genesis 12, the rest of the Bible is the story of the outgrowth of God's working with this one man, Abraham, and the results of God's working in his life and his response to God's working. As we get into the New Testament, we find that there are many other implications of God's working with Abraham, because we find that there are many lessons in terms of doctrine and Christian living that the apostles in the New Testament draw from and conclude from the way in which God dealt with Abraham. You know, in Genesis 10, verse 8, we read that shortly after the flood, Cush, the grandson of Noah, begat Nimrod. And Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth, a great tyrant or despot. That's the sense of the Hebrew word. He was a mighty hunter before the Eternal. And we're told in verse 10 of Genesis 10 that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. That was the starting point for what Nimrod sought to do. Genesis 11 gives us some details about the building of Babel. And we read of a tower of Babel that was constructed. And as we come down through the story, we see God's intervention. And then we read of the family of Abraham. We read that Abraham was born in a city that was a near suburb of Babylon, a near neighbor of Babylon, Ur of the Chaldees. Now, the land of the Chaldees, the land of the Chaldeans, Babylon was the capital. Babylon was the major city. And the empire, the kingdom of Babylon, was the Chaldean empire. Here was a man who was born in the virtual shadow of the Tower of Babel, the symbol of man's rebellion against God. Here was a man who grew up in that society, in that kingdom, in that culture. And there came a time in his life when God began to work with him. And we're told in Genesis 12, verse 1, that the Eternal had said unto Abram, "Get you out of your country, from your kindred, from your father's house, unto a land that I will show you." And so we are introduced to Abraham, or Abram as he was at that time, in the context of God calling him. God began to deal with him and to say, "I want you to leave and to turn your back on this place where you are." Now that's interesting, because that's the beginning of the Bible when you get all the way back to the end, to Revelation 18. You know, Genesis starts out and we read of the city of Babel, the city that Nimrod built. When you get to Revelation 18, you read about Babylon the Great, the symbol of man's end-time rebellion against God. And the message to God's people, Revelation 18, it says, "Come out of her, my people. Come out of her, that you be not partakers of her sins, that you be not partakers of her plagues." The Bible opens in Genesis and closes in Revelation with the message to those who would be the people of God to come out of Babylon. The message to Abraham was, get you out of your country, turn your back and walk away from what you have been part of, and come to me. God called and Abraham responded. And brethren, that ultimately is something that is to be reenacted in the lives of each of us. That God calls and we respond. Now, there are many things to learn. God told him, He said, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I'll bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Eternal had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And he left, and his family came with him, or his immediate family, his wife, his nephew, Lot. We're told in verse 6 that Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem in the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. The Eternal appeared unto Abram and said, Unto your seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Eternal who appeared to him. He removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, Ai on the east. And he built an altar unto the Eternal, and called upon the name of the Lord. And he journeyed going on toward the south, and there was a famine in the land. Now, let's stop right here. Here, Abram responded to God's calling. God said, I have a promise that I'm making to you. I have a place I'm going to give you. I have all these blessings that you're going to receive. Abram believed God and he responded. You see, he acted on faith. If we believe God, we act upon that belief. Abram believed God, he acted upon that belief, followed where God led. When he got down there, what did he find? Well, ran into two difficulties. Number one, he got there and he found out the place he had been promised was already inhabited. The Canaanite was then in the land. Now, immediately you presented a problem. If I promised you that I had a house that I was going to give you, and it's a beautiful place. It sits here on several acres of land, and there are beautiful trees, and there are orchards that are there, and it's a beautiful place. And I really whet your appetite, and I'm going to give it to you, you and your family. And you get there, and the first thing you find is that somebody's already living in the house. They're already occupying it, and they think it's theirs. They let you pitch a tent over on the corner of the property. Now, that, comes as a little bit of a surprise. Perhaps you weren't exactly expecting to get there and to find somebody already living there. They were living there. They were settled in. Looked like they were planning on staying. They were not in the process of packing up and moving out. Not only that, you get there, and as you begin to go through the property, you find out there's a drought. The stream that flowed through the property, that's dried up. The grass is dead. The trees are looking like some of them are dying. And you wind up, you can't even stay there in your tent on the corner of the property. You have to head on over someplace else because there's famine. You can't even provide food there. Now, one of the things we learn from this is that when you respond to God, that does not mean that life is going to be just a smooth, it's going to be like downhill sledding from now on out. God called and I answered. Boy, all my problems are over with. I'm certainly not going to encounter any difficulties. First thing Abraham ran into were problems. And he was responding to God. It wasn't that Abraham was rebelling against God and said, no, I won't leave Babylon. I won't go where you want me to. Abraham packed up and left and did what God told him. And when he got there, he encountered some difficulties. Now, oftentimes we don't expect to encounter difficulties. After all, God called and we answered. Life ought to be pretty simple from now on out. Well, as you go through and read the story of Abraham, you find out it ain't necessarily so. Doesn't necessarily work out that way. Now, Abraham came on, went down to Egypt. Eventually, things improved. Came back up into the land with his nephew, and we're told in verse 13, Abraham was very wealthy. Now, he had his flocks and herds, and Lot had his. And the area where they were, because remember, there were only certain sections of the land that they could use for grazing, because after all, the Canaanite was then in the land. So the area that they were using for grazing was not sufficient for Lot's herds and Abraham's herds, and there began to be conflict between the herdsmen. Abraham found out about it and told Lot in verse 8, "Let there be no strife between us, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen. We're brethren. The whole land is here before us. Separate yourself. You look up here. If you want to go this way, I'll go that way. Let's spread out." Lot lifted up his eyes in verse 10, and he beheld all the plain of Jordan. He looked across the Jordan River, across from the area that Abraham was promised. Abraham was offering to share the promised land with Lot, because Abraham by this time was well past 75 years of age, had no children, undoubtedly must have assumed that Lot, his nephew, who was like a son to him, that Lot would be his heir. Well, Lot didn't want to stay there in the promised land. He looked across the Jordan, saw the plain of Jordan, decided that was the better place. And so he left and crossed the Jordan and went over there to that area. It was a very beautiful area before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot had a proclivity for picking the wrong spot. Now, he chose the plain of Jordan and journeyed east. And verse 12, Abraham remained there, dwelling in the land of Canaan. Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Eternal exceedingly. Now, Abraham must have been a little bit disappointed in this, because we find God coming to him right after Lot had separated himself, and God told him, he said, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are. Look north and south and east and west. All the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed after you. I will make your seed as the dust of the earth. Arise," verse 17, "walk the length of it and the breadth. I'm going to give it to you." So God reiterated the promise to Abraham and encouraged him. Well, a little while later, in chapter 14, we pick up the story, and we find that there was a great invasion of the Middle East, led by the king of Shinar, which was the area of Babylon. There was a confederation of kings that came into the Middle East, invaded that area, were going to conquer it and control the trade routes. They, in the process, conquered many of the cities, including both Sodom and Gomorrah, took captive the people. Well, this news was relayed to Abraham, and what concerned him was that his nephew was there, and his nephew and all of the family of his nephew were taken captive. Well, Abraham immediately gathered together his household servants and took off. God delivered these kings into his hands, and Abraham defeated them and recovered all the things that they had taken. He came back down to Salem, the ancient name of Jerusalem, and here in Genesis 14 encountered Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. Now, you can read who Melchizedek was back in Hebrews 7. Abraham tithed to Melchizedek and received a blessing of him. Now, in the aftermath of that, chapter 15, verse 1, after these things, the word of the Eternal came unto Abram in a vision, saying, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. I'm going to take care of you." You see, God had blessed him and brought him through this situation and allowed him to recover his family, Lot and his family, and bring them all back. Now, as we are going to see the story, there's a contrast in the story of Lot and Abraham. Lot, we're told by Peter, was just Lot. We're told that he was vexed by the things that he saw. Well, he may have been just Lot. He was just Lot. We're told that in the New Testament. But when you read the account in the book of Genesis, you have to conclude he was just barely just Lot. Just barely. Lot made some decisions that contrasted with the decisions of Abraham. And though Lot himself was never part and parcel of what was going on in the society around him, he put himself and his family in a situation that brought some very painful consequences upon them all. Lot had a tendency, he didn't like what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, all the really terrible stuff. He was, we're told that he was vexed by that. It bothered him. But it didn't bother him enough that he stayed out of Sodom. He moved in, right in the middle. First, he pitched his tent toward Sodom. He got as close to the world as he could. And though he didn't become involved in everything they did, he put his family in a situation that ultimately they became so enmeshed in Sodom that when the judgment of God came, he had to turn his back and walk away. And we find that he just barely made it, and his wife did not, nor did most of his family. And as you read the contrast, and I would just suggest, this is a totally different subject, but it is an interesting story in terms of an approach to child rearing, to read the story of Abraham and Lot and their approach toward the world and toward society and toward what they did. Just to study the story of Abraham and Lot and draw your conclusions in terms of the relative levels of success and failure. The Bible is filled with examples and illustrations that help us understand various things. Now, as we come on through the story here in Genesis 15, Abram reminds God and he says, you have made all these promises and you talk about, I will inherit and my heirs, but I have no heir. Eliezer of Damascus, my chief steward, my chief servant, born in my house. If I were to die today, he would be my heir. Is that what you intend? And God said, no. Verse 7, I am the Eternal that brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land. You see, in verse 5, God told him, or verse 4 rather, God said, look, Eliezer won't be your heir. He that shall come forth out of your own bowels shall be your heir. He brought him forth abroad and said, look toward heaven, tell the stars if you're able to number them. And he said, so shall your seed be. Verse 6 is a very simple statement. It says, and he believed in the Eternal, and it counted it to him for righteousness. God made Abraham an incredible promise. And we're told that Abraham simply believed God. Now, he's past 80 years of age at this time. He has no children. And, well, maybe my nephew will inherit. No, he's gone over there. Had no inclination to come back, and promises didn't seem particularly real to him. My servant, I guess, will have to inherit. I have no other heir. No, he's not going to inherit. You are going to have your own child, a child that you will beget. Now, that's an incredible statement. Abraham has waited all these years, but we're told he believed God. God said it, and he believed it. Didn't understand how, didn't see how it could work, but he believed God. The story of Abraham is the story of a man who believed God and acted upon that belief. Now, God's made promises and years have gone by. God began to tell him some things here in this dream about when his heirs would inherit. Well, chapter 16, time has gone on, and Sarah, his wife, had never been able to have children. Sarah had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So she came up with an idea one day. She said to Abram, behold now, the Eternal has restrained me from bearing. I pray you, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. Sarah said, look, this isn't working. We haven't had any children, and at this point we're not going to have any. We're told, see in verse 16, that Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born. So, let's say, when Sarah approached Abraham about the subject, Abraham was about 85. He had left to come to the land that God had called him to inherit when he was 75. So 10 years have passed since Abraham has come here to the Promised Land. Now, you know, we all have a tendency sometimes to put a time limit on God. Sarah's time limit was 10 years. That's long enough. This is obviously not working. I've got an idea. I've got a handmaid. I'll give her to you, and that'll be sort of like my child. It'll be your child, and you know, I'll just raise it up, and that's what we'll do. Well, Abraham did what she suggested. He took Hagar. He had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Hey, that's a long time to wait, right? Particularly when you're 75 at the start of it. And Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. He went in unto Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Now, all of a sudden, she began to look down on Sarah. She began evidently to think in her mind, well, you know, my status has certainly changed. I'm the one that's going to have Abraham's son. And so things began to change, and within a very short time, Sarah realized that she had made a terrible mistake. She was very upset. She came to Abraham and said, "My wrong be on you. It's all your fault." That sort of thing has happened from time to time. It's all your fault. I gave my maid into your bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judged between me and you. And Abraham, who knew that discretion was the better part of valor, said, "Behold, your maid is in your hand. You do whatever you want to. I am not, you're not getting an argument out of me on this. You go ahead and do what you want." Well, we're told that Sarah began to deal harshly with Hagar. You see, what happened was now, what had seemed like a good idea to Sarah at the time, all these emotions and feelings were brought into play, and Sarah was jealous, and she was upset, and she was angry, and Hagar, who had been taken a haughty approach after she realized she was pregnant and began to sort of look down on her mistress and consider that she was a replacement to her mistress. She was going to take Sarah's place. And, of course, Sarah began then to retaliate, to deal hardly with her. And Hagar fled. And the angel of the Eternal found her by a fountain of water. And God's angel addressed her and asked and told her to return to her mistress and to submit. And the angel said, the angel of the Lord told her, verse 10, that God had said, "I will multiply your seed exceedingly. It'll not be numbered for multitude. You're going to bear a child, a son, and his name will be Ishmael." Verse 12, "He'll be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he'll dwell in the presence of all his brethren." You know, this was a description of the Arab peoples who traced their descent to Ishmael. He was going to live a wild, nomadic life, and his descendants after him. A description of the Bedouin Arabs and their, they love nothing better than to fight. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He's going to be over there. All of them are going to be dwelling together. All the extended family. They're going to multiply, and they're going to have a lot of strife. They're going to be a wild, nomadic type people. But they're going to multiply and become a great nation. Multitude of nations, as you look at the Middle East today. So Abraham was 86 when Hagar bore Ishmael, verse 16. Now we come on forward another 13 years. Chapter 17, verse 1, Abram was 99. And the Eternal appeared unto Abram and said, "I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be you perfect." And I'll make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. Neither shall your name be any more called Abram, your name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made you. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. I'll make nations of you. Kings will come out of you. I'll establish my covenant between me and you, and your seed after you, and their generations for an everlasting covenant. I'll give unto you and to your seed the land wherein you're a stranger, the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. God told Abraham, verse 9, You shall keep my covenant, you and your seed. This is my covenant. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. It shall be a token of the covenant. Into verse 11. He that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you. And so God told Abraham in verse 15, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. I will bless her and give you a son also of her. And I'll bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. And Abraham fell on his face and laughed. That was the funniest thing he had heard in a long time. Here was Sarah up past 80. Never had any children. He was 99. And God said, You're going to start a family, you and Sarah. And that just struck Abraham as pretty funny. In fact, that was the funniest thing that he had heard in a long time. And he just couldn't help laughing. Shall a child be born to her that's 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 bear? By the time we could have a child, I'm going to be 100 and she's going to be 90. And God said, yes. Name, he is to be known from now on as Father of a Multitude. Now he's 99. He had one child and God said that one doesn't count. We're going to start over. And from now on we're going to call you Father of Multitude. You know, people must have thought Abraham was quite an optimist to tell him at age 99 that he needed to be known as Father of a Multitude from that time on. But you know, Abraham believed God. Now, you know, sometimes God allows things to get to a point, and this is crucial, and we'll see it expounded in the New Testament. God allowed these years to pass because He wanted it to be clear that the son Abraham had was the result of God's miraculous intervention. It was the answer of a divine promise, not simply the natural course of events. If Abraham had had a child at 75 and Sarah at 65, people would have said, well, you know, that's getting pretty old to have children, but it would have been a little more reasonable or plausible than to wait till he was 100 and she was 90. By that point, no one would conclude this was just simply the natural order of events. You see, Isaac was the response or was the result of God's miraculous intervention. The result of a miracle of God. He was the seed of promise. Ishmael was the result of the natural course of events. One represented a human solution, and the other represented God's miraculous solution. So Abraham came out, and at age 99, he was circumcised. He took Ishmael, his son, who was 13, and circumcised him, and all of the household. And from that time on, the children were to be circumcised on the 8th day, but everyone in the household, all the males, were circumcised at this point. The Arabs, by the way, still follow Ishmael's example rather than God's instruction, and rather than practice circumcision of the males at 8 days of age, they practice it at 13 years of age. That has been their practice through the centuries. Now, in chapter 18, God appeared to Abraham here in the plains of Mamre, and has a conversation with Abraham, reiterates the promise to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah, when she heard it, she laughed too. And God said, you know what we're going to name that child? We're going to name him Laughter. You think it's funny? Well, we're going to name him Laughter. We're going to call him Isaac. That's what Isaac means in Hebrew. It means laughter. And everybody that hears it's going to laugh. So, Sarah, God talked to Abraham and reiterated the promise, and then he began to talk to him about Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, instead of having learned a lesson when they were conquered, this group of kings, a number of years have passed now, perhaps 15, 20 years have passed. And instead of getting better, Sodom and Gomorrah have gotten worse. And God says, this is it. I'm going to go down there and destroy those places. And Abraham was very concerned about Lot. And he said, well, Lord, you wouldn't destroy the righteous with the wicked, would you? And he began to talk with him about, what if there's some righteous people down there? And he finally whittled the number down to 10. If you can find 10 righteous people, spare the city. Well, the reality was, God didn't find 10 righteous people. Well, the story goes on and it tells about Lot leaving Sodom. Lot reluctantly left Sodom because of whom he had to leave behind. Lot had made some decisions that had created some real problems. Well, the result was Lot was spared, Lot and 2 daughters. Well, in the aftermath of this, chapter 20, Abraham journeyed toward the south. We find in chapter 21 that God visited Sarah, as he had said, and she conceived, verse 2, and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And the child was called Isaac, and Abraham circumcised Isaac when he was 8 days of age, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. And Sarah said, God has made me to laugh, so that all that hear it will laugh with me. She said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? I have borne him a son in his old age. So here was a happy, joyous time. Here was someone who had waited all of these years, long past the time when there was any reasonable human expectation. God intervened and produced a miracle, and the child was born. Well, there was a feast made when Isaac was weaned, and verse 9, Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar, mocking. He was making fun of little Isaac, and he was a teenager. He was well into his teens by this time. Little Isaac was just a little fellow, a toddler, or what we would term a preschooler. And Ishmael was picking at him and making fun. And Sarah got mad. And she said to Abraham, cast out this bondswoman and her son. The son of this bondswoman shall not be heir with my son, with Isaac. And in this verse, by the way, is the whole heart and core of the contention in the Middle East. Who is the heir? The son of Sarah or the son of the bondswoman? The son of Hagar. Well, this thing was grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. Abraham loved Ishmael. God came to Abraham and he said, don't be grieved about this. I'll take care of Ishmael. I'm going to bless him. But in Isaac shall your seed be called. Ishmael will produce a great family, and he will have many descendants. But he's not to inherit with Isaac. In Isaac shall your seed be called. The promises I've made to you will be fulfilled through the son of promise, the son of a miracle, the son that you've had by the name of Isaac. I'll make of the son of the bondswoman a nation, because he is also descended from you. So Abraham got up early the next morning, gave them food and provisions, and sent them forth. They somehow got lost and got entangled in the wilderness of Beersheba. And now were overcome with the heat and the lack of water. And Hagar was overwhelmed at this. She thought that her son was going to die. God sent an angel to provide for them and to show them the well where there was plenty of water, and to pronounce again the promise that they would, that Ishmael would produce a family and would ultimately become a great nation. So the story goes on in chapter 22. Years have now passed. Isaac has grown up quite a bit. And in chapter 22 we're told, it came to pass after these things that God did test Abraham. He said unto him, Abraham, and Abraham answered, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and get into the land of Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains that I tell you of. So Abraham rose up early in the morning, saddled his ass, took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son, clave the wood for a burnt offering, rose up and went to the place that God told him of. Now, here we are many years down the road, perhaps 50 years after God had first called Abraham, or something approaching that. And once again, God calls and Abraham responds. God gives an instruction and Abraham acts upon that instruction. The story of Abraham is the story of a man who responded to God. Now understand, Abraham knew that it was God to whom he was responding. He wasn't hearing some sort of just mysterious voice in the dark. God had dealt with him in a personal way, even appearing and sitting down and eating a meal with him, over a period of almost 50 years by this time. God had dealt with him in a very specific and personal way, and Abraham knew that this was the one that had dealt with him, that had made these promises. Abraham knew he was responding to God. And so he couldn't comprehend all that was happening, but he did what God said. Came to the point of preparing his son to sacrifice, lifted up the knife, and at the very last minute, the angel of the Lord called and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Verse 12, Lay not your hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and he saw a ram. And he took the ram and offered him for a burnt offering instead of his son. And the angel of the Lord, verse 15, said unto Abraham, By myself have I sworn, says the Lord, because you've done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. In blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven. The promises were made unconditional. And Abraham believed God. Abraham responded to God. Now God asked Abraham, as we saw earlier in chapter 17 in verse 1, God said to Abraham, I want you to walk before me and be you perfect. I want you to become just like me. You know, the covenant God made with Abraham was the basis of every subsequent covenant that God made. And there are a number of covenants. Not only was there the Sinai covenant with Abraham's descendants, but you know, he made a covenant with David, he made a covenant with Levi. There is a new covenant that was prophesied in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, that we find Jesus Christ coming as the messenger of that covenant. But all covenants have been based upon the covenant God made with Abraham. And God's request to Abraham was, I want you to become like me. Walk before me and be you perfect. Be completely upright and wholehearted and sincere. Now, how did Abraham try to put into practice God's request? We find later in Genesis 26:5, when God reiterated the promises made to Abraham, when He reiterated those promises to Isaac, He told Isaac in Genesis 26:3, I want you to sojourn in this land, and I'll be with you. I will bless you. Unto you and unto your seed will I give all these countries. I will perform the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I'll make your seed to multiply. Why? Verse 5. God had asked Abraham to walk before Him and be perfect. Remember Genesis 17:1. He said, I want you to do that and I will make my covenant. Now God tells Isaac, stay here because I'm going to perform the oath that I swore to Abraham. Verse 5, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Abraham understood what God meant when He said, walk before me and be you perfect. Abraham knew what the commandments were. He also knew what the statutes and the laws were. He knew the law of God, including the Ten Commandments. Abraham knew that what God wanted was obedience. When God said, walk before me and be you perfect, in effect, God was asking Abraham what He has asked all who would respond to Him in faith. He said, I want you to become like me. I want you to reflect my nature and my character. I want you to respond to me in faith. And that response involves obedience. And Abraham did. And God blessed Abraham. Now, as we go on through the story, let's come back to John chapter 8. Here is Jesus speaking to Jews in His day, to those who were physical descendants of Abraham, through Isaac and Jacob's son Judah. These were Jews who had heard the words of Jesus Christ. And they had believed what He was telling them. Verse 30 of John chapter 8, as Jesus spoke these words, many believed on Him. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on Him, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And they answered Him, and they said, well, we're Abraham's seed, and we're never in bondage to any man. How do you say, you shall be made free? And Jesus said, truly I say unto you, whosoever commits sin is the servant of sin. The servant abides not in the house forever, but the Son abides forever. Totally different status of servant and son. The servant is there as long as the master wants him there. He has no claim to inheritance. The son is the heir. Ishmael did not abide in the house forever. He was a servant, the son of a servant. And the time came when he was sent forth from the master's house, sent forth from Abraham's house, not to inherit the promises through Abraham. Isaac was the heir of promise. Sarah said, the son of the bondswoman shall not be heir with my son. Now, Christ draws a spiritual principle from that. And He said, you right now are servants. You think you're free. You think we're the children of Abraham. You're physically descended from Abraham. So was Ishmael. You're physically descended from Abraham. Big deal. So was Ishmael. But Ishmael wasn't the heir, was he? He didn't abide in the house forever. He was not entitled to the inheritance of a son. Christ told them. He said, you're the servants of sin. You're servants too. You're spiritually in servitude and in bondage. And the only way you can inherit is to have the status of sons. The son is entitled to abide in the house forever. The son is the heir. You're physically in bondage to the Romans right now, as the Jews were, and you're spiritually in bondage to sin. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They didn't think they needed the freedom that He offered, and they did. Notice back in the book of Galatians, now there was a matter of dispute in which the Galatians had become entangled. And the dispute had to do with how do we enter into a relationship with God? How are we made just? How are we justified? Made innocent? How is it that we are guaranteed access to God? And the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans and in the book of Galatians goes back to the story of Abraham. Because you see, the Jews viewed circumcision, the reason circumcision was such a giant issue in the New Testament, is in the mind of the Jews, it was the means by which access to God was guaranteed. You remember the inner court of the temple? The courtyard where the altar of sacrifice was? Entrance through the gate. See, there were outer courtyards. There was the court of the women. There was the court of the Gentiles. But the inner courtyard, where the sacrifices were actually made, entrance into that was forbidden unto all who were uncircumcised. If you remember the story in the book of Acts, I'm not going to turn back there for the sake of time, a riot was started there in nearly the end of the book of Acts with the accusation, the rumor that was spread that Paul had brought two uncircumcised Greeks into the inner courtyard of the temple. And they almost tore him limb from limb. In fact, the Roman soldiers grabbed him, and they didn't know what was going on. They just saw this riot and this man about to be pulled apart. The accusation, the initial accusation made, which was totally false, people had seen him around town with these two Greeks. They assumed, somebody said, well, I bet he brought him into the temple. Yeah, I bet he did too. Next thing you know, you had a riot. Rumors and gossip and people reacting to ill-founded rumors is not something unique to our day and time. It's been around for a long time. Only exercise some people get is jumping to conclusions. And they do it enough that they ought to be well exercised. And that was the case in Paul's day. But you see, it was a major issue. Because to approach the altar, to offer an animal, to present an animal there at the altar, was in that sense to enter into fellowship, to become a partaker of the altar. Part was burned on the altar. That was God's part. Part was taken by the priest and eaten by him. Part was taken by the offerer and eaten by him. So the picture was of a meal in which the offerer and God shared a meal with the priest as the mediator, as the one who sort of brought things together, as it were. And so it was a picture of partaking, of sharing, of fellowship, of communion. Paul, that's the same phrase. The word in the Greek that's translated communion, by the way, is a term that means sharer, or it's translated partaker, it's translated fellowship. It means to share, to share together, have something in common. So here was the picture. The Jews in their mind viewed circumcision as the means by which access to God was guaranteed. Paul proved the point in Romans and Galatians by saying, when did Abraham establish a relationship with God? When did Abraham enter into a relationship with God? When he was uncircumcised or when he was circumcised? Abraham established a relationship with God 24 years before he was circumcised. God called him in Ur of the Chaldees and said, I want you to get up and leave and go to a place that I'll show you. And Abraham responded. Circumcision was a sign of the covenant. Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. Abraham had a relationship with God based upon faith. He believed God and responded to God's requests. And when God said, I want you to be circumcised and to circumcise your descendants, Abraham did so. That was his response. But that was not the basis of his relationship with God. He had a relationship with God before that ever occurred. Circumcision was the result or the response to the relationship that he already had with God. So the Jews had missed the point, and they viewed physical rituals, the so-called works of the law, the means by which purification in the ceremonial sense was accomplished. They viewed that as the means by which access to God was granted. And Paul, of course, made plain that if you can do something that moves you from being a sinner into right standing with God, if you can move yourself by a physical action from guilt to innocence, then obviously Christ died in vain. What's the point of Him having died? Why did He have to come as our Savior and as our sacrifice if you can do something that will move yourself by your own action from guilt to innocence? No, we have access to God by Christ through faith. Same way Abraham had access to God. Abraham believed God. So Paul begins to explain that and expound that, and then he gets down here in Galatians 4:21, and he says, tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? Don't you hear what the Torah, the law, that part of the Bible says? You want to be under all of these rituals which you think is the means by which you can obtain right standing with God. Haven't you read what the Torah says? It is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondswoman, the other by a free woman. He who was of the bondswoman was born after the flesh. He was the result of natural human action. He that was of the free woman was by promise, the result of a miracle of God, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which leads to bondage, which is Hagar. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. Jerusalem of that day was an occupied city. Roman legions marched up and down in the very shadow of the temple. The Roman flags fluttered in the wind. The Roman shields and spears glistened in the sunlight. The tramp of the feet of the Roman soldiers as they marched in and out on the cobblestones. The rattle of the chariots. All the pomp and glory of Rome. Jerusalem was an occupied city. A Roman governor sat ensconced there. Jerusalem below was in bondage. And those who were the citizens of Jerusalem were not only in physical bondage to the Romans, they were in spiritual bondage. They were, as Christ explained in John 8, they were the servants of sin. They had not been made free from the hold of sin. They were sinners doomed to death, because the ultimate curse of, to be the servant of sin is to mean that you're ultimately going to die. That's what the wages of sin is death. We've earned something. Hagar represents Mount Sinai in Arabia and answers to Jerusalem that now is and is in bondage with her children. Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. The new Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, Jerusalem above, our capital city, the city that is our mother city, is the new Jerusalem, the city that is free. There is a contrast. Verse 28, and we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. We're the children of promise. Verse 31, so then, brethren, we're not children of the bondswoman, but of the free. That which was the result of normal human action, of natural human effort and endeavor, that didn't lead to freedom and sonship. It was the result of God's miraculous intervention. You see, the covenant given by God at Sinai did not provide a solution to sin. It laid out God's righteous requirements, same requirements given to Abraham. It laid out God's righteous requirements, but it did not provide the solution when you fell short of those requirements, which all have. See, sin is the transgression of the law, but all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And the wages of sin is death. So the covenant at Sinai did not provide the solution to servitude. It pointed God's standard, and the people said, all the Lord has said we'll do. And God let them prove that on their own they couldn't. The new covenant, proposed or prophesied in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Jeremiah. We're told in Hebrews 8, God says, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days. I will write my laws into their hearts and into their minds. And I'll be to them a God and they'll be to me a people. God didn't say He was going to do away with the law. He said He's going to put the law in our heart and mind. He's going to transform us from the inside out through the working of His Holy Spirit. The new covenant was established upon better promises. The promise of the Holy Spirit. A promise of eternal inheritance. The Apostle Paul uses the story of Abraham to illustrate for all people of all time that the key to a relationship with God, access to God, a relationship with God, becoming the son and heir of God, is that we respond to God in faith. Living faith. You know, faith without works is dead. Abraham believed God, and so when God told him to go and do something, he did it. That's living faith. He acted upon what he believed. And brethren, we are given the opportunity to inherit as the spiritual sons of Abraham. If you're Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise made to Abraham. But if we will be Abraham's children, we must respond as Abraham responded. We must believe God and respond to God's call in